Fine, if you'd all sit down after the excitement of the battle over Greece that didn't happen. Very disappointing. I'm Martin Wolf of the Financial Times, and I've been asked for some reason to moderate this session, which is on a subject on which I know absolutely nothing. But I'm honest enough to admit it. That's the difference. Before I introduce the discussion, which is on investing in human capital, and I love international organizations, KBC. And because you are all unbelievably highly qualified professionals, you will know what this is, right? I assume it's knowledge-based capital. I didn't know, so well done. To help reduce unemployment and inequality. So this is the session subject, which seems to me quite important and interesting. Let me introduce the panelists briefly. To my left is Harlem Désir, who's Secrétaire d'État chargé des Affaires Européennes in the French government. Next to him is Mr. Joachim Levy, who is Minister of Finance, Brazil. Next to him is Michaela Marksova, who's Minister of Labour and Social Affairs of the Czech Republic. Next to her is Mr. Phil O'Reilly, who is from New Zealand, is chair of the Business International Advisory Council. Business and Industry Advisory, another acronym. I'm sorry, I'm not as good as you are. Well done, thank you. Next to him is Pierre Carlo Padoan, who was for many years, of course, chief economist here at the OECD, and now has the really simple job instead of being Minister of Economy and Finance of Italy. And next to him is Mr. Richard Trumka, who is president of CHUAC and president of the AFL-CIO, representing obviously the Labour view, as Mr. O'Reilly is the business view. And finally, to his left is Angel Gurria, and I'm not going to introduce him. I think this is, we're going to try and have a lively discussion of the questions raised here. I think the idea is they should link with the general theme, not just of investment. Investing in human capital and knowledge-based capital is clearly a very important form of investment, but also another and related theme, inclusion and inequality. So this is the interaction of these two. And I would just make two introductory points. If we're talking about investment in human capital and knowledge-based capital, these are, of course, inputs. And inputs are very important, but inputs, as we know very well from experience, don't necessarily generate outputs. Neither outputs in terms of actual activity or the desirable outputs in terms of inclusiveness and so forth. We've lots of examples of countries which have invested heavily, for example, in university education and have ended up then with unemployed graduates. We have had constantly the theme of having invested massively in human capital and then finding the educational requirements of jobs rising without necessarily improvements in performance, and with a very large number of disappointed people who thought they were investing in skills that would give them high quality, highly engaging jobs, and they found, in fact, those jobs weren't available in the economy, and they ended up doing less skilled jobs and being overqualified for them. So it's, I think, very, very important in such a discussion not to focus just on inputs, and I hope we will have a good discussion of outputs. And I hope, in addition, indeed I am confident in this case, that we will have lots of vigorous disagreement. Otherwise it will be very boring, and I'm against boring. Now, of course, I've been told what questions to ask. The only thing I will do before not really asking the questions I've been asked to ask is, related to them, is we need very brief responses, please, from the member of the panel, who I'm going to choose somewhat at random. I hope, so there'll be some excitement. Make a focused response, and it would be good if you could keep your responses to a couple of minutes or so we can have a real discussion. Now, the question I've got started with was, how can we promote more inclusive growth? And this should relate to the theme. I thought maybe the way of sharpening this is for each of you to think of what, from your point of view, is the single most important thing that could be done in the context of your economy to promote inclusive growth. So there are obviously, you will all have a very long list. I imagine it's everything. But what is the single most important thing that you really need to do to promote growth which actually improves the living standards and prospects of life of the population as a whole? And for reasons which might be sort of obvious given the nature of the challenges, I'd like to start with Mr. Levy.
Good morning. Well, thank you for the question. I think that in a country like Brazil, of course, is education. And also, of course, the challenge about education is that it's not a matter of spending or even how to spend, because education, even if you have new technologies, and in Brazil, especially at the college level, we do see a lot of new technologies helping to double the number of people getting higher education. Education, to a large extent, it still depends on people and on person-to-person relationship, teachers and so on. So also motivating teachers, guaranteeing uniformity of the material that is really presented to children and stimulate them. These are things that don't have easy questions. But we have no doubt that increasing the spanning of education, we are lowering the age at which children start to get educated, and also increasing the age at which they are still entitled to get education. This, I believe, is the most important thing we can do to get more inclusion. And things like having general exams, things that really create a level playing field for children from all ages. I think it's also very important, because when your knowledge is easy to be recognized, also increase your chance in labor market.
Just a very quick follow-up. In terms of Brazil, with its very special challenges and obviously real resource constraints, do you see the relative priority as being primary, secondary, or tertiary education? You talked about education. There are lots of different, or even post-tertiary, skills education for people already employed. Where would you put the marginal resources?
I think that these days is in high school, secondary, because we have already a very good coverage. Maybe you can improve the quality, but you have very good coverage for basic education. College, there are many ways to go. But to get the population, the pipeline for people to college, which now is a required level of education for most jobs, you need to have a stronger secondary education.
May I turn to you, Minister Markova, for your answer on the single most important thing to do in your country to improve inclusive growth?
So thank you for the floor. I'm very sorry, but it's also education. And yesterday at the dinner, we have heard from Mr. Mayor of Rotterdam, education, education, and education. Today we have heard from the Dutch Prime Minister, investment, investment, investment. So I would like to say that it's necessary to have social-minded investments. And concerning which kind of education, if I am thinking about our children from the socially excluded population, then I would like to emphasize not even primary, but the preschool education already. Because if we do not start with preschool education, we can't dream of getting these children to even secondary schools or colleges, as you say. So for my country, for excluded children, preschool education, but for those children who are not excluded, who are already included because they are from included families, then I would emphasize the secondary education, because we do not match education with the needs of the labor market in quite a big scale, I would say.
So there are some follow-up questions to come, but before I do that, we've got a lot of consensus so far, very depressing, but I hope this will change. may I ask Mr. Padoan for the Italian, from his perspective, both from Italy and, of course, more broadly?
Well, my perspective is perhaps preliminary to the education story, which I fully endorse. It's about employment. It's about the fact that a country that has gone through 3 years of prolonged recession, losing up to 10% of GDP, scars in the system are deep. And they are especially deep if you look at youth unemployment and women unemployment. So that is, to me, the single most worrying element and driver of inequality, which needs to be addressed, because it's not just about revamping demand, which of course is very much needed, but also changing the nature of the labor market. And of course, this is where the reform effort has been pointing at in the first place in my country. This is just the beginning of the story, but the next step would be, of course, high quality, as high as possible quality of jobs. But in order to have high quality jobs, you have to have jobs first. That sounds obvious, but it is the utmost concern.
Can you just, this is, I mean, obviously no one is possibly going to deny that we should have more jobs.
That's why I said it.
But perhaps I could push you a little bit further. But it obviously ties into the discussion we just heard on structural reform and demand questions.
Yeah.
So how do we get these jobs?
Yeah, of course, that's the real question, right? Well, you get jobs when you grow. And when you grow steadily and over the medium term. I'm fascinated by the debate whether it's more demand or supply. After having, as you mentioned, having spent a few years in this place, wonderful place, which I miss a lot, by the way, especially in my current job.
We all understand why in your current job.
It's both. I would say to myself, it's both stupid. It's both supply and demand. And I also would invite whoever is interested in the topic to ask a slightly different question. When you're looking for longer-term growth and therefore more stable job creation, what is the ultimate driver, especially in an advanced economy or an advanced region? It's productivity, long-run productivity. So this is where we go to the next element, what I understood being the KBC story, which is KBC, not K something else. And therefore, if you go back to episodes where jobs were created, both in Europe and in the US, you would find, this is what I think I would find, that they are highly correlated with long-term productivity growth phenomena. And this is inevitably linked to innovation, productivity, and therefore we go back to education. So this is our way I see it. We have to restart a job machine, which in an advanced economy, which by definition is near the technology frontier, cannot be but about high quality jobs.
I'm going to come to that in a minute because it's down in the list. And before I do so, we've got 3 more speakers on their views, and I just have the last person who worked for government before I hear from the outsiders telling us why everything they've heard is nonsense. Mr. Desir.
Merci de l'invitation, merci de...
Thank you very much for your invitation, and thank you for this question. I obviously agree with what my counterparts have just said, but I believe that the right to education and to lifelong learning must be stated clearly. Now, there are economic stakes, and this is what Pier Carlo Padoan mentioned on productivity, and in the OECD's economic outlook in the chapter on France, it says the population's skills need to be stepped up for long-term and inclusive growth. So there are 2 prongs here. There's an economic aspect, investing in human capital, in training, and that is obviously necessary in order to restore long-lasting growth. But then there's the social or human aspect, because this isn't just about figures. And of course, we have these figures in mind because there's still 24 million unemployed people in Europe. So we do need more jobs, but we need to create jobs that involve technology, know-how, and this has to do with digital economy, nanotechnologies, robotics, design. So restoring growth will happen, but we do not want it to mean that we will be displacing workers and pushing them out of the labor market. So not only will we have working poor, as we have had in other economic cycles in capitalism, and not just in Europe, but we would in addition have workers lost in transition, lost in translation, meaning a new category of unemployable workers with outdated skills or with occupations that do not match the growth dynamics. So I agree with the primary school, secondary school issues, even in France, because 140,000 of our youth leave our school system without any training every year, and that is one of our priority, and it has to do with the people, the youth who are left behind in our education system, because even in an industrial and a major educational system such as France's, we have to face up to this issue. But the second issue is the right to lifelong learning and to permanent education. And we created a training account for every worker to have a training capital that the person can turn to throughout his or her career if he or she is unemployed, but even if he or she is not unemployed, meaning if this worker feels that he or she needs to update her personal or professional skills and face the changes in the economy.
I have something up in front of here about Wisembly. Well, there seems to be some comments, but there doesn't seem to be a question. So if there is a question, somebody can come and tell me. At the moment, I'm going to ignore it till educated otherwise. Okay, we've heard a widespread agreement on education, lifelong education in this case, concerns about workers lost in transition, or perhaps given the nature of the employment actually being generated by our economies, which is in fact the point I made earlier, which I think is very, very important, the link with supply and demand. So how would you respond to the question, Mr. O'Reilly?
Well, let me put a qualification on some of this. There's no question that education is the number one thing we can do to promote inclusion. No question about that. But the question that you've asked is about inclusive growth. And that's a different thought. It's a slightly different thought, certainly. So if we think about inclusive growth, then I completely agree with Pierre Carlo. The number one thing we can do to promote inclusive growth is to make sure we get jobs, and then over time we build the quality of those jobs, and hopefully as quickly as possible build the quality of those jobs. Unsurprising, Pierre Carlo would say that, because some OECD research that was done when he was here said that. Some of the early work on inequality and inclusion said that actually what you want to do is achieve jobs. The number one thing you can do about not just inclusion in an economic sense, but also inclusion in a social sense. People find worth in going to work. Well, now that's interesting. How would you then get those jobs? And that's where education comes in very importantly, because education's one thing. It's good to have an education. But to the point that you made at the start, if all we do is train sports psychologists, well, that's not going to help much. What we need to have is education, sure, the usual things, but we need to make sure that we create work-ready skills. And those work-ready skills will largely be increasingly around science, technology, engineering, and maths on the hard side. Then on the soft side, employability skills, emotional intelligence, capacity to have customer service, teamwork, resilience, and so on. That's where the big gap is occurring. We've still got employers, even in high unemployment countries, saying that 90% of them are saying they still can't find people because they still can't find the right skills. So there's this clear mismatch going on. So education's important, but we need to make sure we've got work-ready skills. We have the right conversation about how education actually contributes to labour market outcomes. And then on the second side, it's all very well to have all of those things too. You still won't get growth unless you get investment. And that's the point about the conference here. That's a very important point. How do you get investment? And companies are telling us that they're not investing because of policy and regulatory uncertainty, taxation and other costs to business, restrictive or burdensome regulation. Hence the point that Catherine Mann was making earlier on about the importance of structural reform. So it seems to me that if employment is the key, and it certainly should be, then we need to make sure we've got work-ready skills on the one hand and investment on the other. Neither are easy to get, but I think that's the best way to think about inclusive growth.
Finally, Mr. Trumka.
Well, first of all, let me go back to last year, and remember I said I didn't know which OECD I was talking to, the Monday OECD that talked about inequality, or the Tuesday OECD that talked about austerity. And there's still a tad of that left. I want you to know I'm proud to tell you that, because tucked away in the back of this outlook is a thing that calls for lowering labor standards, which is the opposite of what we've been talking to. But this year I have a different analogy for you. You remember Wimpy on the Popeye cartoon? He always wanted to have a hamburger. He'd pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. Well, for 8 years, workers have paid with lost jobs, lost savings, and lost wages with the promised recovery of Tuesday. And your report continues along those lines. We can look forward to Tuesday sometime. Let me, Martin, answer the question precisely with you. While investing in worker skills and education, I think is critically important for the long run, or the long-term well-being of workers in society and the economy as a whole, it's not a solution to reducing the current unemployment problem or reducing rising inequality or the decline in labor share of national income. Because the real problem, whether we're looking at the economic stagnation in Europe or the radical rise in inequality in the United States, is wage suppression driven by fiscal austerity, mass unemployment, and the weakening of labor institutions relative to other economic actors. And so what I would say to answer you, your one thing, we need a different set of structural reforms that raises wages and doesn't cut them. And we can start by raising the minimum wage across the OECD, because nothing would be more effective in helping the poor than doing that. And we also have a problem with part-time freelancing and misclassification workers. That's starting to rise. We can take care of that. But most importantly, it really is time to restore a political and economic voice to the majority of the population of OECD countries, whose bargaining power and political voice is succumbing slowly to the rising power of the 1%, as described by Professor Piketty. So we would offer a more aggressive, far more aggressive approach to raise public investment and expansion of demand for goods and services, calling on structural reforms that raise wages, not lower wages, that strengthen institutions like collective bargaining rather than weakening them, so that the aggregate demand can be increased and you can start growing your way out of the problem, not trying to shrink your way out of the problem.
Well, I'm going to see that we have complete agreement on this panel. We have incredibly little time for an immensely important subject, but let me just follow up before we get onto this innovation issue, which towards the end. It seems to me there are sort of two challenges that have come up from this discussion, big challenges. So let's start with the education theme. And I won't be able to ask everybody, but if somebody wants to respond passionately, indicate to me. And if, Angel, you want to respond. We talked about preschool education, we talked to secondary education. This will, if everything goes very, very well, change the labor force slowly over the next half century. If it goes with secondary education, it will change the labor force slowly from 5 years onwards, but it's still, the whole labor force turns over a period of about 45 years nowadays. So it's a very long run policy. That doesn't make it wrong. Doesn't make it wrong, but it clearly isn't enough to deal with the challenges which Mr. Trumka dealt with, listed. So once we put the park education for the moment and assume, yes, we clearly should have the best educated labor force we can possibly have in future, what do we do now, if anything? So, Mr. Levy, Minister Levy, would you like to, if anything, and how would you respond, particularly the challenge Mr. Trumka raised, and also Mr. O'Reilly, on things that could be happening now?
course, Brazil is a somewhat different situation because even today we are at a very low unemployment rate, and until recently we were creating a lot of jobs, so we are slightly out of sync. But of course, it's a global problem, and I think in the short run you have less freedom, and the question of creation of jobs. Our experience in Brazil, that it's quite limited what you can do just with demand support policies. So even in the case of Brazil, as we see the growth of our partners persistently slow, we are moving maybe to the other strategy that was talked just before here, which is investment. And in the case of Brazil, which is a very large country, is investment in infrastructure, not only to generate energy and things like this, but also lower costs of transportation, lower costs that ultimately will make companies more efficient and would allow us to create jobs. So in the short run, there's not much option out of that if you look at the supply side. I mean, investments, the beauty of it is that if you complete them, at the beginning, they are demand-side policies, but they pretty soon become supply-side policies, and with that, you can sustain the effort.
Mr. O'Reilly. Yes, and Minister.
One
very
really,
brief, and
so one really immediate thing I think governments and businesses can think about is this issue of long-term unemployed. We've done some statistical analysis now, putting my New Zealand hat on, that if you're an 18-year-old Maori man in New Zealand and you're unemployed for about 6 months or so, the chances are that you'll die younger, sicker, and poorer than otherwise you would have if you'd had a job at that time of your life. So a lot of the conversation, I think, needs to be quite gritty, quite micro conversations between government and business about how can we make sure we co-invest in those long-term unemployed, not just to get them a job, but to keep them in a job. And that suggests really quite hard-edged conversations about the right skills, who's investing in those skills, and then pastoral care for those young people as they come into their first job because they won't be familiar with it. New Zealand's going through that experience right now with some success, I must say. So to answer your question about what can we do right now, some of that work I think we can do right now.
Minister Markova.
My name is Mark Sova, like
Mark
Karl Marx or Marks and Spencer,
I
so it
missed
should
that.
be
I
easy.
I apologize.
Never mind. I think what we do with it, what is an immediate help is that through our public network of labor offices, we do support requalification of people, and we do it together with businesses, and it's based on kind of regional councils where people from business, from the labor offices, and from trade unions meet. So we try really to work close with the business and see what they do need, which kind of people, and we help them for public money to train these people.
Mr. Trumka.
I just want to say, the outlook that was given this morning is important because it clearly identifies the drag that fiscal austerity has played on the entire system. So the first thing I think we need to do is understand and acknowledge that fiscal austerity is not going to get us out of this. It got us into this problem, and we ought to shed it. The second thing is we should encourage more public investment in infrastructure and in public goods. By doing that, you create a climate where private investment feels more comfortable, more confident, and you start to crowd in private investment as well. That creates a cycle upwards, and hopefully combined with labor structures that are increasing wages that can create demand, we can actually work ourselves out of this and create the jobs that are necessary to work ourselves out of this.
Minister Paduan.
In the long term, of course, you need a better education system, which takes, as you said, Martin, a long time to produce benefits. But in the short term, and also listening to what colleagues just said, there's a lot that the governments can do in terms of using much better the limited money in placement services and learning much more from the private sector what they really need for the given set of skills, which can be used much better even if they're not changed.
Can I just, you might well respond, but I want to marry something that Mr. Trumka said with some of the other stuff going on. It seems to me you all are either ignoring or being rather myopic about what we know technological change and the change in the pattern of structure of employment in our economies is actually doing. I mean, what is actually happening and is likely to continue is a significant hollowing out of the middle of the labor force, and which makes, one, social mobility much more difficult, clearly, because people have to jump much further, and is part of the pattern generating higher income inequality. And this is being driven by a whole set of technological changes, and it links then very much with the second question, which I'm now asking: how can we foster innovation to promote business jobs and productivity growth, but also to foster inclusiveness? And it seems to be you're sort of implicitly assuming that if we generate more skilled people, automatically the labor force the composition of employment will adjust to that. Why? There's no reason why it should. It might not at all, in which case we won't have improved anything. Aren't we just being far too optimistic about the innovation process, both its rate, which has been emphasized in terms of productivity and all the rest, and its characteristics, which seem to me increasingly clearly are working against inclusiveness, not for it, in important ways. Would you like to comment on that? Or anybody else would like to react to that pretty big challenge, which I think is also implicit in what Mr. Trumka is saying, though he sees policy, the minimum wages and so forth, as being able to deal with it?
Je suis pas sûr d'avoir la réponse, mais
I'm not sure I have an answer to that, but one of the strategies we've been trying to develop is the connection between academia, research centers, and what we call competitiveness areas that are struck by a lot of unemployment, etc. We're trying to develop common strategies that bring together innovation, research, what's going to underpin the growth of tomorrow, and what involves training, both vocational and high-level training, academic training. Obviously, education will have show its benefits over long periods. We're going to have to wait some generations. But we also need to step in the very short run to get people to learn through doing so that they get back into the work mode. This is obviously significantly tailored to the younger unemployed in our society, because it's women and the young who are most left out of what little progress has been registered here. But everybody who's within the workforce has to go on training all through their lives.
We've got this question of innovation and the way it's interacting with our economy, the robot revolution is often talked about. How do we foster innovation and productivity growth, but also in a way that actually spreads opportunity and doesn't, as it seems to be doing, and there's quite a lot of evidence, close it down?
Firstly, you do to get innovation, you do the basic things that are really boring to talk about but need to be done. Product, market, competition. So if you get more competition in an economy, you're going to get more innovation in an economy. It's just that simple. And we see that a lot, where you're seeing incumbent companies stopping competition or lobbying against competition. That's just going to get in the way. Second thing then, though, is build things. There was a great question on the screen, which I was looking at a minute ago, about what's the role of youth entrepreneurship in creating youth employment. Great question. It's big is the answer to that question, because if you can create entrepreneurship, you'll create startup opportunities, startup innovation. I just don't think we should be as deterministic about labour market outcomes as you suggest. Labour markets are not one big box where a certain number of jobs exist and some are high skilled and some are low skilled. I think the new type of skilled jobs that we've got coming in the future will not necessarily be those that require a PhD. They'll be those which require social intelligence or those which require global skills. They'll be just different. So my sense is what we need to do is just make sure that innovation goes on. I don't think we should say, hey, let's stop the train. let's close all this down, because then we will certainly be dead. The point will be to make sure that innovation can grow, and then make sure that we can be as inclusive as possible about allowing people to become skilled, which is the point that my colleague was making about women, youth, migrants, those with a disability and so on. I just think if we can get that soup right, then good things will come, so long as we've got great competition in markets.
Minister Paduan, may I just ask you for a and then final, Minister Levy. The Italy, I tend to, when I do presentations, say Italy entered into zero productivity growth before the other developed countries, but it turned out to be the forerunner. Perhaps it's slightly unfair, but we're certainly there, fully, the UK. So what do you do to change that? And how do you change that? That's as you rightly said, and everyone said, it is the single most important issue. So
first of all, we did run into the negative growth rate of productivity, not just the zero.
I was being
kind. Yes,
complimentary.
thanks for that. But that's hopefully behind. And of course, the problem with that is that this has been going on for 20 years or so. So we have to revert not just a recession, but a long trend towards negative productivity. So what do you do? Well, you do a number of things. There's no shortcuts. Basically, because the ultimate users and producers of innovation are companies. So you need to ask the question, what do companies need in order to introduce more knowledge and innovation in their production, and at the same time generate jobs out of that? You need regulatory changes to make it simpler. You need finance to make it more available for more risk-taking. You need a taxation system consistent with your budget constraint, which favors investment and favors investment in jobs, and therefore you need to tax something else to get that. And you need to have incentives for companies to grow. So you need a number of things that we are introducing in the country, since you mentioned Italy, by providing tax, financial, and regulatory incentives to companies that will go innovative, meaning they will invest in R&D, they will hire human capital, and so forth. But if I may, this is the way to create jobs in a country in Europe. Europe has a problem of itself as an area. I don't know whether I'm not going to talk about Greece. Europe, in going into deeper integration, especially the euro area, we'll need to tackle that problem as well. How to deal with instruments that at the European level facilitate reallocation of jobs so that we put jobs on the technological frontier and grow more.
Minister Levy, you wanted to speak?
Yeah, very briefly. I think that as was hinted in the case of New Zealand, but elsewhere, I mean, there's this dichotomy between low skill, maybe emotional, but service activities and jobs that will only have higher pay if there is real structural change in the way the economy works, and then a lot of or maybe not that many jobs of highly skilled jobs, but that are associated with a very high degree of capital. I mean, and competition is very important. What do we see is more and more things that involve a huge initial investment and then the marginal costs that are very low. This is a different situation that we have seen in the traditional industrial economy. And if you don't address that, I don't see how, especially in mature economies, we're going to solve the question of growing jobs and also what's usually called, I mean, high quality jobs.
I've been told, I'm very obedient, that I should ask up to 3 questions from the floor. There's a microphone somewhere floating around. So I'll take 3 questions. Oh, did you want to?
No, just a question.
Oh, you had a question.
Yeah, well,
you will be allowed to say the last word, I think.
No, not quite. Just a brief commentary. We wanted, of course, to listen from all our guests, but I want to say to Richard that because of Nike, we're now kind of at midnight between Monday and Tuesday, kind of starting to see the light, okay? Making progress. Now, there is a concept which everybody referred to after talking about education. That's the question is, and it's a concept which includes education, innovation, in a way competition, vocational training, lifelong learning, which is of course skills. We just delivered our skills report in Norway. We just delivered a skills report in Portugal. We're delivering our skills report to Spain next month. We're working now with Mexico. We're working with Turkey. This has become, we have made all these correlations and everything. And the question of skills, having measured skills and the how badly we are prepared in terms of skills and the demands of the market today already as a bad diagnosis, then the question is skills, 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 and skills will solve the question of employability. Skills will improve the capacity of the ones at the lower, the bottom of the ladder in terms of income, because if you upgrade their skills, of course, they will be not only more employable, they'll be able to get better wages. It also will increase productivity. That means that accumulates for the whole, not only for the individual, for the whole of the economy. And last but not least, skills will allow you to better absorb the technological changes that come with innovation and investment. That will then trigger more demand, more growth, and you go into the virtuous circle. So I'd say skills, skills, skills.
Thank you very much. I'm going to this gentleman here, over there, so behind there. Go ahead.
Chris Coles, the Capital Spillway Trust.
I can't hear you. Go ahead now.
Chris Coles, the Capital Spillway Trust. I'm very interested in that if you want to educate, you need a school. But if you want to employ, you need another structure entirely. You need a little business structure. Part of it is legal, part of it is administrative, but an essential element is the equity capital to be able to establish it. And what you are not talking about is how you deliver that equity capital. And even more important, what is your aiming point for the number of these little structures and therefore the amount of capital that you need to invest? Someone yesterday...
sorry, I'm really apologize. You made your point, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Somebody here? Yes, please.
Yes, hi, Matthew Grabois from BNP Paribas. You've talked about education as being the thing to invest in, and I completely agree with you. And you talked about high school education specifically. That's something for the future, perhaps. I would agree that technology goes in the classroom, but what can you do right now to convert those skills? Because we need jobs right now.
Okay. Third question, somebody over here. Anyone wants to ask anything? No? Somebody over there. Wonderful.
Yes, just a question. We spoke about skills, knowledge building capacity, occupation, productivity, and so on. Perhaps putting all these terms in a circular hierarchy, you can easily understand that their interdependency and interaction is not a secondary topic. So that I think that something that can bring all together is the term inclusive prosperity, proposed by Larry Summers a few weeks ago. And our group is trying, for example, to propose the Trans-European Network of Social Infrastructure, just to remember that investors cannot invest in a demand side shaped on the use of fiscal income, because their demand side is something very different. And for this, we think also that needs are not a demand side. Thank you.
Okay, that was a comment, and I will take it as a comment. Can I start with there are two questions which I can get. I'll start with Mr. O'Reilly on one, because I think it's most relevant to you, which is we're going to have all these startups, and which is going to transform the world. I think it's more or less complete nonsense, but that's what everybody thinks. How do we fund them?
You try and make sure that you don't want to fund all of them, just for a start, because some of them are rubbish. You're absolutely right. You don't want to fund them for long. So you want the capacity for businesses to start and fail. I agree with you that I think we talk too much about tech startups as if somehow that's the solution. Actually, no, it's going to be boring old startups like restaurants and courier businesses as well, and all sorts of businesses. It's also going to be about business growth. The key issue, of course, is to get them finance and then to give them financial education on the other hand to make sure that they themselves are asking the right questions about their business plan and about the way they think about growth. On that financing side, one of the key issues that the B20 is talking about for the last 2 years is that in many economies, simply banks aren't going to lend to small business. And a lot of that's about removing the regulatory thicket around what we've come up with in terms of banking regulation since the crisis, trying to make sure there's regulatory coherency around banking regulation and around the capacity for banks to lend so they're more likely to be disciplined in their lending to small business. That's the number one thing I do, but I'd also make sure that we have the right kind of financial education and so on amongst young people so when they think about startups, they have the right kinds of conversations.
Does anybody else want to comment, one of you, on the funding of new small business and its relevance to this challenge?
I may just make another comment. Sorry to go back to Europe, but you know, this is one area where there is a lot of scope for progress in Europe. I'm not just talking about the euro area, I'm talking about the EU and the single market. Capital Markets Union, which I understand is something the UK likes most about the EU integration process, should be more targeted at providing finance for innovation, which nowadays is not enough in my view. It's much more ordinary credit, which is good for itself, of course, but here we're talking about something different in terms of risk-taking, so I would hope that we move in that direction.
I mean, obviously the implication of the question was equity is particularly important. Risk-taking capital is crucial. It can't, and Europe has a very bank-based financial system. That is a problem. Richard Trumka, you wanted to comment on this?
I do. I wanted to comment on something that Angel said and what one of the questioners said about more skills. Angel says more skills means higher wages, and that's not necessarily true. I wish it were true, but it isn't. Last year in the United States, those with the advanced degrees, PhDs and other advanced degrees, had their wages regress more than any other group in the United States. Those with bachelor's degrees had their wages regress less than PhDs, but more than people without a bachelor's degree. So there isn't a correlation, a direct correlation between greater skills and greater wages. That's why I talk about structural reform that allows those things to happen. When you get higher skills, it should translate out, but you have to increase the voice, the buying power, the political power, and the bargaining power of those workers. Because what's been happening is it's been disintegrating. And there's a total imbalance of power right now between corporations and workers. That balance needs to be restored for a number of different things. One, it produces better results. Two, it provides a better distribution of income, which allows workers to have greater buying power. In the United States, 72% of our economy is driven by consumer spending. So if workers don't have money in their pocket, they can't spend, they can't create the demand necessary to create jobs and to grow our economy. So I come back to, we need structural reforms that unleash the bargaining power of workers and actually allows them to raise their wages so that as their skills do increase, their wages do as well.
I'm going to ask, I'm supposed to stop in a minute. Very beaten, said, Minister Levy, you were asked a question, I think, and maybe Minister Marksova would like to comment too. Skills now. There's been a lot of discussion about this. How far, and there was a nice question underneath, which I think is particularly relevant to you, Minister Levy. If you're cutting budget deficits because you have to, how do you maintain crucial spending in areas like this?
Well, I think the question of credit and business plans, these are not directly affected by fiscal plans. The other things are first priorities In the case of Brazil, education is quite well protected against cuts. But as I mentioned, actually, and we have also large program of training for shorter term programs for training, so Pronatec is the name. I mean, the real thing there is matching with the demand of the companies. And actually we do that usually tied with trade bodies and so on, so that we are reflecting the immediate need. It could be construction, it could be specific areas, oil, for instance, and so on and so forth. I mean, this has been helpful, and this in large scale can be financed without too much of a drain in our budget.
Minister Maxova, you have the last word.
Say
whatever you want. The
okay.
last word.
So I would like just to briefly comment on the low-skill people, because today I think they are actually, even those jobs they need some quite high skills. And what we in our country are now kind of rediscovering is those schools, this system where the schools are closely connected to companies. And we had them before '89, but then we destroyed them within kind of new ideology, because we saw that the free market is not going to need them. So now we are going back to basics.
I know we've covered these incredibly huge issues very inevitably superficially, but I think it's been quite interesting. I've been told that I have to summarize this, which seems, but briefly, so be optimistic. So I'm going to make 2 points. Inevitably, and of course these are correct, we've agreed that we're in favor of education and innovation. I didn't really expect anyone to say we wouldn't be, and clearly we are. How much of a change these things will make in the short to medium run, which obviously many people are concerned about. By the short to medium run, I mean the next decade or so, is, I think, very much an open question. I don't want to repeat any of the points made about education and innovation, because it seems to me that they covered most of the sorts of issues one might be concerned about. But there is one, so that's the first big area. The second thing that, in a way, I could be tie our discussion here with the discussion in the previous session, is this whole question of structural reform and what we mean by it. I've increasingly come to the view that the phrase structural reform should be made illegal. It is completely and utterly meaningless without content. That is to say, one has to be precise what one means by structural reform. Some of the things that some people mean by structural reform, it seems to me pretty clearly, are going to make some of the problems we talked about here worse, and some of them will make it better. And that is, I think, part of what Mr. Trumka said. So I think one of the conclusions you should draw from these discussions is that whenever anybody says structural reform, they should be called upon to make very, very precise statements about what that means and what the impact that would have on the things people are concerned about. And the final comment I'll make, but of course it's not really a summary because it's a repeat of a remark that I made before, while I accept completely that the economy isn't fully determined, as Mr. O'Reilly said, the impact of technological change and the pattern of demand is unbelievably powerful on employment, at least across very large economies like the US and Europe, whose structures of output are very heavily dictated by the structure of demand. I mean, there's a limit to what trade does for them. And if you look at what the structure of demand is doing for our economies and the structure of technology, it is going to make many of the challenges we're talking about here very, very much more difficult. And the idea that on all possible ways, innovation is your friend, which is, I think, very widely believed and very much put forward by a lot of people in business, just seems to me false. And it's very important to recognize the really painful trade-offs, which is, I think, one justification, if I may defend Mr. Secretary General Correa, why the OECD sometimes sounds as though if it's a little bit inconsistent on these questions. Thank you very much.